My daughter-in-law pushed my wife into the kitchen at Christmas dinner. 24 hours later, every card she had stopped working. I never imagined I would say those words out loud at 71 years old, especially not after spending my whole life believing that family was supposed to be the one place where respect never had to be earned twice. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because sometimes I wonder how far pain can travel before someone else recognizes it. Christmas had always meant something in our family. It wasn't about gifts. It wasn't about expensive decorations or perfectly wrapped boxes under a tree. It was Margaret. It was always Margaret. For 42 years, my wife made Christmas feel like something sacred. She baked cinnamon rolls before sunrise. She hung stockings with little handwritten notes tucked inside them. She remembered everyone's favorite pie, everyone's favorite drink, everyone's favorite traditions. She made a house feel alive. Even now, after all these years, she still woke up before me every Christmas morning. I could hear the quiet sounds from downstairs. Cabinet doors opening, the soft clinking of dishes, coffee brewing, familiar sounds that somehow made the whole world feel safe. That Christmas Eve, I came downstairs around 7:30 in the morning. Margaret stood at the kitchen island wearing the red sweater I'd bought her years ago, white snowflakes stitched across the front. Her silver hair rested softly against her shoulders. She was smiling while arranging sugar cookies onto a tray. She looked up at me and smiled the same way she smiled when we were 25 years old. "Morning," she said softly. I didn't want to wake you. I walked over and kissed her forehead. "You've been up for hours, haven't you?" She gave me a guilty smile. "Maybe a little." I laughed quietly. Some things never changed. Outside the kitchen window, snow had started falling, small flakes drifting down over our backyard. The old maple tree stood covered in white, and the Christmas lights along our fence glowed against the dark winter sky. Everything looked perfect. Everything felt perfect. Daniel and Vanessa were coming over later with Emma. Margaret had spent 3 days preparing dinner. 3 days. Turkey, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes with marshmallows, green bean casserole, homemade rolls, pecan pie, pumpkin pie. The refrigerator looked like it had been preparing for an army. "I hope everyone likes everything," Margaret said while adjusting a tray on the counter. I looked at her and smiled. "Margaret," I said, "if they don't like it, they're crazy." She laughed. But then something happened. Just for a second. Her smile faded. Not completely. Just enough that I noticed it. She looked down at the counter and smoothed her hands against her apron. "I just want a night to go well," she said quietly. I stared at her for a moment. "What does that mean?" She looked back at me quickly and smiled again. Too quickly. "Nothing." Then she picked up the cookie tray and walked toward the dining room. I watched her go. Something felt off. Not wrong exactly. Just different. Like hearing a familiar song and realizing one note had changed. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself Christmas had everyone stressed. I told myself not to overthink it. Looking back now, I should have listened to that feeling. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the house smelled like cinnamon, roasted turkey, and fresh bread. Christmas music played quietly from the speakers in the living room. Margaret always kept it low enough so people could still talk without raising their voices. She used to say holiday music should sit in the room like candlelight, not like a marching band. I sat in my chair near the fireplace watching her move around the house. Even after 42 years of marriage, I still found myself doing that. Watching her. Not because she demanded attention. Quite the opposite. Margaret had a way of taking care of everything without making noise about it. She adjusted throw pillows. She folded blankets over the couch. She checked silverware one more time, then checked it again. I looked toward the dining room table. 8 place settings. White dishes with gold trim that we only use during holidays. Red napkins folded carefully beneath each plate. Small candles sat in the center beside pine branches and tiny silver ornaments. Margaret had been setting that same table almost every Christmas since Daniel was a little boy. Some traditions become so familiar that you stop noticing them. Until one day you realize they are the reason a house feels like home. Around 5:30, the front doorbell rang. Margaret looked up immediately and smiled. A real smile this time. Bright and warm. "They are here," she said. She practically hurried to the door. I followed behind her more slowly. Daniel walked in first carrying a stack of wrapped presents. Emma ran past him wearing a green sweater with little snowmen across the front. "Grandpa," she shouted before wrapping her arms around me. I laughed and hugged her back. "Look at you. You grew another inch since Thanksgiving. Mom says I am almost as tall as Grandma now, she said proudly. Behind them, Vanessa stepped inside wearing a cream-colored coat and tall boots, carrying her purse over one shoulder while glancing down at her phone. Merry Christmas, she said with a smile that somehow looked practiced. Margaret stepped forward and hugged her. You look beautiful, Vanessa. Oh, thanks, Vanessa said quickly before looking around the house. Wow, you really went all out again. Something about the way she said again sat strangely with me. Not rude exactly, just flat, like someone commenting on the weather. Daniel looked exhausted. I noticed it immediately. Small things. Dark circles beneath his eyes. The way his shoulders slumped. He smiled, but it felt delayed somehow. Like he had remembered halfway through that he was supposed to. We all moved into the living room, while Margaret disappeared into the kitchen to check dinner. Emma sat beside me and started telling me about school and her Christmas concert. Daniel turned on a football game. Vanessa sat on the couch scrolling through her phone. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. I realized Margaret had not sat down once. Not once. I looked toward the kitchen and saw her carrying another tray toward the dining room. Then back into the kitchen. Then back out again. I stood up and walked over. Margaret, I said quietly. Sit down for a minute. She looked up and smiled. I'm almost done. You said that 20 minutes ago. She laughed softly. But something felt different again. Smaller this time. Harder to catch. I looked into her eyes and saw tiredness there. Not physical tiredness. Something else. Something heavier. Then before I could say another word, Vanessa's voice drifted across the room. Margaret, are the sweet potatoes ready yet? Margaret looked toward the living room and answered with her usual gentle voice. Almost ready. Then she smiled at me and turned back toward the oven. I stayed beside her for a moment longer. I wanted to say something. I wanted to ask why she looked nervous in her own house on Christmas Eve. But then Emma called for me from the living room, and the moment slipped away. Funny how life works sometimes. You think important moments announce themselves. You think they arrive like storms or alarms or flashing lights. They do not. Sometimes they pass quietly while football plays on television and cookies cool on the counter. About 30 minutes later, dinner was finally ready. Margaret carried the last serving dish to the dining room and stepped back with a tired smile on her face. The table looked beautiful. Turkey sat in the center surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, green beans, stuffing, rolls, and cranberry sauce. The candles cast soft light across the room, and for a second everything looked exactly the way Christmas used to look. We all took our seats. Or at least most of us did. I noticed Margaret standing beside her chair adjusting napkins and moving serving spoons. Vanessa looked around the table for a moment and frowned slightly. Actually, she said casually, Daniel should sit next to Emma tonight. Margaret looked up. Oh, Vanessa smiled. Just for pictures and everything. Margaret nodded immediately. Of course. She moved to another chair without hesitation. Then a few minutes later, Vanessa looked around again. Actually, maybe I should sit over there too. She pointed toward Margaret's new seat. The lighting is better on that side. Margaret smiled again. That is fine. She moved again. I watched quietly. Daniel looked down at his water glass. He did not say anything. Nobody said anything. 10 minutes later, Margaret still had not sat down. She was carrying dishes back and forth, asking if anyone needed anything, filling water glasses before they were even empty. I looked at the untouched plate sitting in front of her. Vanessa picked up her fork and looked toward the kitchen doorway. Margaret, could you grab the gravy? Margaret stood immediately. Oh yes. She disappeared into the kitchen and came back carrying the gravy boat. Then Vanessa smiled. And I think the rolls are still in there too. Margaret turned around again. Back into the kitchen. Back out. Then back again. I felt something cold settle into my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just discomfort. The kind that sits quietly before it turns into something else. Emma noticed it too. Children always do. She looked toward her grandmother and then toward me. Her little forehead wrinkled slightly. Margaret finally pulled out her chair and started to sit down. Then Vanessa laughed softly and waved her hand. Margaret, honestly, maybe it would just be easier if you stayed in the kitchen tonight. You keep getting up anyway. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Nobody breathed. I looked at Margaret. She froze for only a second. Just 1 second. Then she smiled. That same small smile I had seen earlier that morning. The one that never reached her eyes. Oh, she said quietly. I do not mind. She picked up her plate and stood there holding it against her sweater. Daniel stared down at the tablecloth. Emma looked confused. The Christmas music still played quietly somewhere in the background. Silver bells. Soft piano. Snow falling outside. I stared at my wife standing there in her own dining room holding her dinner plate like a guest who was not sure she belonged. Time seemed to stop for a moment. Not because somebody shouted. Not because somebody cried. It was the opposite. Everything kept moving. The Christmas music kept playing. The candles kept flickering. Snow continued falling outside the windows. Somewhere in the living room, the football announcer's voice drifted quietly from the television. Life kept moving while something inside me stood perfectly still. Margaret gave that small smile again and turned toward the kitchen doorway. She carried her plate with both hands, carefully, almost politely, as though somebody had done her a favor instead of removing her from her own table. I watched her disappear into the kitchen and felt something tighten in my chest. Daniel picked up his fork. Vanessa adjusted her napkin. Emma stared toward the kitchen. Nobody spoke. I looked around the table slowly. I suddenly felt like I was sitting with strangers wearing the faces of my family. Then memories started arriving one after another. Quiet little memories. Small things I had ignored before. Funny how memory works. It does not knock politely before entering. It simply opens the door and walks in. I remembered Mother's Day 2 years earlier. Margaret had spent all morning making brunch for everyone. Pancakes, eggs, fresh fruit, bacon. She had even bought flowers for the table because she wanted the day to feel special. Then Vanessa spent almost the entire brunch talking about reservations she had made for dinner later that evening. Just immediate family, she had said with a smile. Margaret had smiled back and said she understood. But later that night, I found her sitting alone on the back porch staring out at the yard. I asked if she was all right. She smiled and said she was just enjoying the weather. I believed her. Then another memory surfaced. Emma's birthday party last spring. Margaret arrived carrying handmade decorations and gifts she had spent weeks putting together. Vanessa thanked her and then quietly moved everything Margaret made to a side table while store-bought decorations filled the center of the room. I remembered seeing Margaret standing beside the cake table, holding a roll of ribbon in her hands. Smiling again. Always smiling. Then Thanksgiving. Last Thanksgiving. Margaret spent nearly 6 hours cooking. I remembered walking into the kitchen and finding her washing dishes alone while everyone else sat laughing in the living room. I remembered saying, "Leave those until later." I remembered her answer. "I do not mind." I closed my eyes for a second. 3 simple words. I do not mind. How many times had I heard her say that? How many times had she quietly stepped backward so somebody else could step forward? How many times had I watched it happen without seeing it? Across the table, Emma looked up at me. She was not eating. Her little eyes moved toward the kitchen doorway again. Then she leaned closer and whispered softly, "Grandpa?" I looked down at her. "Yes, sweetheart." She lowered her voice even more. "Why is Grandma eating in there?" I looked at her small face and suddenly I had no answer. Because children still live in a world where certain things do not make sense. And maybe they should not. Maybe a child should never understand why the kindest person in the room somehow ends up alone. Emma kept looking toward the kitchen doorway while the rest of the room pretended everything felt normal. I looked at my granddaughter and forced a small smile. "Grandma is just finishing something up," I said quietly. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth. Not because they were untrue, because they were incomplete. Children notice incomplete truths. Emma looked down at her plate, but did not start eating. I noticed she kept twisting the corner of her napkin between her fingers. Daniel finally cleared his throat and reached for the mashed potatoes. "Everything looks great, Mom," he said loudly. Too loudly. Margaret answered from the kitchen. "Thank you, sweetheart." Sweetheart. I had not heard her call him that in months. Not because she stopped loving him. Margaret never stopped loving anyone. But there was something fragile in her voice now. Something careful. Like someone walking across ice without knowing how thick it was. Vanessa smiled and picked up her wine glass. "Margaret always makes enough food for 30 people, she said with a little laugh. "I do not know how you keep doing all this every year." Margaret walked back toward the table carrying another dish. "I enjoy it." Vanessa smiled again. "You work too hard." Then she turned toward Daniel and started talking about some new neighborhood development project they had been discussing. Just like that. The conversation moved forward while Margaret quietly returned to the kitchen. I looked toward Daniel. My son laughed at something Vanessa said, but I noticed something strange. His eyes never really lifted. He smiled, but his shoulders looked heavy, tired, almost distant. Then I felt a small hand touch my arm beneath the table. Emma leaned toward me again. "Grandpa," she whispered. "Yes, sweetheart." She glanced toward the kitchen first, making sure nobody heard her. Then she said something that made my entire body go still. "Grandma cried in there last Thanksgiving too." I stared at her. I think my heart stopped for a second. "What?" I said softly. Emma looked down quickly. I was looking for cookies. Her little fingers twisted the napkin tighter. I saw her standing by the sink. She paused. She was smiling when she came back out, though. Nobody heard us. Nobody noticed us. Vanessa was talking. Daniel nodded quietly. Christmas music drifted through the house. But I felt the room changing around me. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. Last Thanksgiving. Margaret standing at the sink washing dishes before dessert even started. I remembered asking if she wanted help. I remembered her saying she was fine. I remembered seeing her face from across the room. I remembered thinking she looked tired. Just tired. Dear God. I had missed it. I had missed all of it. Emma looked at me carefully. "Grandpa," she asked, "did I say something bad?" I looked down at her little face and felt something heavy settle deep inside me. I reached over and held her hand gently. "No, sweetheart," I said quietly. "You did not say anything bad." Then I looked toward the kitchen doorway again. Margaret stood by the counter arranging dessert plates by herself, smiling that same small smile. The smile I suddenly realized I had been believing for years. The rest of dinner moved around me like background noise. I nodded when people spoke. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I even laughed once when Daniel said something about Emma's school concert. But I could barely hear any of it anymore. My mind kept returning to the same image. Margaret standing by the kitchen sink last Thanksgiving. Margaret carrying her plate out of the dining room tonight. Margaret. Smiling. Always smiling. I suddenly realized something that made me feel ashamed. I had spent years believing kindness and happiness looked the same on her face. I had stopped noticing the difference. Dessert came and went. Gifts were opened beside the tree. Emma squealed over a new art set, while wrapping paper covered the living room floor. Vanessa sat on the couch scrolling through photos on her phone and posting pictures online. Daniel looked exhausted. Margaret sat quietly in her chair beside me, folding tissue paper into neat little squares before placing it into a trash bag. Even after everyone finished opening presents, she still found something to do. Small things. Invisible things. The kind nobody notices because they simply expect them to happen. Around 10 o'clock, Daniel stood and stretched. "We should probably get going," he said. Vanessa nodded immediately. "Emma has a long day tomorrow." We walked everyone to the front door. Snow had piled up another few inches outside. Cold air rushed into the house as Daniel pulled on his coat. Emma hugged Margaret tightly around the waist. "I love you, Grandma." Margaret smiled and kissed the top of her head. "I love you too, sweetheart." Then Emma looked up and said quietly, "Next year you sit beside me." For a second, nobody moved. Vanessa gave a small, awkward laugh. Daniel looked down. Margaret smiled and brushed Emma's hair back gently. "That sounds lovely." A few minutes later, headlights disappeared down the street, and silence returned to the house. Real silence. The kind that settles into walls. Margaret closed the front door and stood there for a moment with her hand resting on the doorknob. Then she took a slow breath and smiled at me. "I think it turned out nice." Nice. I looked at her and felt something twist inside me. Nice. I watched her walk back toward the kitchen and begin gathering empty glasses from side tables. As if tonight had been ordinary. As if none of it happened. I followed her into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. "Leave those until morning," I said softly. She kept rinsing dishes. "I do not mind." There were those words again. I walked over and gently took the dish towel from her hands. She looked up at me with surprise. "Harold." I looked at her for a long moment. Really looked at her. There were tiny lines beneath her eyes I had never noticed before. Tiredness. Sadness maybe. Quiet things. Hidden things. "How long?" I asked softly. She blinked. "How long what?" I swallowed and looked down at the towel in my hands. "How long have you been pretending not to mind?" Margaret stared at me for a few seconds without saying anything. The faucet kept running softly beside us. Water moved over the dishes while Christmas music still played somewhere in the living room. I watched her eyes. For 42 years I had looked into those eyes and believed I understood everything inside them. Suddenly I was not so sure anymore. She looked down first. Then she gave a small laugh. Not because something was funny. I knew the difference. It was the kind of laugh people use when they are trying to make sadness sound smaller. "Harold," she said softly, "you are being dramatic." Dramatic. I almost smiled. Margaret had always done that. Whenever something hurt her, she made the pain smaller so nobody else had to carry it. I shook my head slowly. "No." She looked up at me. "No," I repeated. "Not tonight." She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something else. Then she looked down at the counter instead. Her fingers rested against the edge of the sink. Quiet. Still. "I did not want problems," she said after a long silence. I felt my chest tighten. Problems. Her eyes stayed lowered. "Daniel works hard. Vanessa gets stressed. Emma is still young." She swallowed softly. "I just wanted everyone to be happy." I stared at her. Those words hit me harder than anything else had tonight. Not because of what she said. Because of what she did not say. She did not mention herself. Not once. I moved closer and leaned against the counter beside her. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Snow continued falling outside the kitchen window. Tiny white flakes drifted through the darkness under the backyard lights. Finally, I asked quietly, "Has this been happening for a while?" Margaret took a slow breath. Sometimes people do not realize how they sound. I looked at her. "Margaret." She closed her eyes for a second. Then she nodded very slightly. "Just once. That was all. Just one small movement." But somehow it felt heavier than shouting. Heavier than tears. I looked down at the floor, and suddenly all the little memories from the past few years started fitting together. Pieces clicking into place. Vanessa changing holiday plans at the last minute. Margaret ending up in the kitchen during family gatherings. Daniel becoming quieter every year. I remembered birthday dinners where Margaret barely sat down. I remembered conversations being interrupted. Decisions being made without her. I remembered seeing things and dismissing them because they seemed too small to matter. Small things. Funny how damage rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in tiny pieces. One moment. One comment. One quiet humiliation at a time. I looked back at Margaret. She was staring out the window now, watching the snow. "Why did you never tell me?" I asked softly. She smiled again. That same smile. Smaller now. Sadder somehow. "Because I thought if I said it out loud," she whispered, "then it would become real." I felt something settle inside me then. Something cold and steady. Not anger. Not yet. Anger burns hot. This felt different. This felt quiet. I looked toward the dark living room beyond the kitchen and realized something for the first time all night. I had spent years protecting my family. But somewhere along the way I forgot to protect the person who built it. I did not sleep much that night. Margaret fell asleep beside me sometime after midnight. But I stayed awake staring at the ceiling while shadows from the Christmas lights outside moved slowly across the room. The house felt quiet again. Too quiet. I kept hearing little things in my head. Vanessa laughing. Daniel looking down at his plate. Emma whispering beside me. Grandma cried in there last Thanksgiving too. I closed my eyes, but the images stayed. Around 6:30 the next morning, I slipped out of bed and walked downstairs. The coffee maker hummed softly while the sky outside still looked dark blue. Snow covered the backyard now. Everything looked untouched. Clean. Peaceful. Funny how snow does that. It covers things for a little while and makes you think the world is simpler than it really is. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and opened my laptop. I do not know exactly why I did it at first. Maybe instinct. Maybe years of business experience. Maybe something deep inside me already knew where to look. Vanessa had handled a lot of family logistics over the past few years. Subscriptions, shared accounts, travel bookings, investment summaries Daniel never had time to review. I had trusted her. Family makes trust feel automatic sometimes. I logged into our family management portal first. Then I looked through linked expenses. Nothing unusual at first. Grocery payments, utilities, school expenses. Then I noticed something. A second linked account attached under authorized family access. I frowned. I clicked on it. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. Then another account appeared. Then another. I sat there staring at the screen while little pieces started fitting together again. Credit extensions, shared access privileges, supplementary cards, purchase histories, luxury clothing stores, spa memberships, furniture purchases, vacation reservations. Thousands of dollars moving quietly through accounts I barely remembered approving years earlier. Not stolen, not hidden exactly, just absorbed, layer after layer, quietly, carefully, like ivy growing across a wall until eventually you forget what the wall looked like underneath. I leaned back slowly in my chair. The amount itself was not what bothered me. I had done well in life. Money had never been the issue. Respect was. Trust was. I stared out the kitchen window again. Margaret walked downstairs a few minutes later wearing her blue robe and fuzzy slippers. She smiled sleepily when she saw me. "You are up early." I looked at her standing there with messy silver hair and tired eyes. The woman who spent 42 years putting everyone else first. The woman who kept making herself smaller so nobody else would feel uncomfortable. I smiled back. Could not sleep. She walked over and kissed my cheek before reaching for a coffee mug. "Everything all right?" I looked down at the laptop screen for a moment. Then I closed it quietly. Not because I was hiding something. Because I was thinking. Really thinking. Business taught me something a long time ago. People reveal themselves when they believe nobody is watching anymore. I looked at Margaret and took her hand gently. "I think I forgot something for a while," I said softly. She looked confused. "Forgot what?" I held her hand a little tighter and looked out at the snow-covered yard. I forgot who I was supposed to be protecting. The next morning moved quietly. Too quietly. Margaret made breakfast like she always did. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee. She stood by the stove humming softly while morning sunlight reflected against the snow outside the kitchen windows. Looking at her, nobody would have guessed anything had happened the night before. That was Margaret. She had spent years carrying discomfort without letting it spill onto anyone else. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. I looked down at the screen. Michael Foster. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked into my office before answering. "Morning, Harold," he said. "I reviewed everything you sent over." I looked out the office window toward the backyard. And there was a short silence. "Nothing illegal," he said carefully. "But there are far more linked privileges than I expected. Supplemental access. Secondary cards. Automatic spending authorizations." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Can it all be paused?" Michael hesitated. "It can." I looked toward the hallway where I could hear Margaret moving around downstairs. Cabinet doors opening. Dishes softly touching the counter. Small sounds. Familiar sounds. "Do it," I said quietly. Another silence. "Everything?" Michael asked. I stared out at the snow. Then I thought about Margaret carrying her dinner plate into the kitchen. I thought about Emma whispering beside me. I thought about all those years of smiling through hurt. "Everything," I said. Around 2 hours later, my phone rang again. "Vanessa." I looked at the screen for a few seconds before answering. "Hello." Her voice sounded sharp and confused. "Harold, something is wrong with my cards." I sat quietly in my office chair. "What do you mean?" "I mean none of them are working." I heard movement in the background. Car doors maybe. Wind. I was at a store and they all got declined. I said nothing. "Harold?" she asked again. "I froze them," I said calmly. Silence. Complete silence. "Then you what?" I leaned back in my chair. "I froze everything linked through family authorization access." "Why would you do that?" Her voice rose slightly. I looked down at my desk. At the framed photograph sitting beside my computer. Margaret and me at the beach 10 years ago. She was laughing in the picture. Looking at me instead of the camera. "Because I reviewed things," I said quietly. "And because I spent too many years overlooking other things." More silence. Then I heard Daniel's voice somewhere in the background asking what happened. Vanessa lowered her voice immediately. "Harold, there has to be some misunderstanding." I almost smiled. Misunderstanding. Funny word. People use it when truth starts becoming uncomfortable. I looked out the window one last time. Margaret was outside now, standing near the bird feeder in her winter coat. Snowflakes drifted around her while she scattered birdseed across the yard. Peaceful. Gentle. Still taking care of things. Still making space for others. I watched her for a long moment. Then I said quietly into the phone, "Money was never the problem, Vanessa." Another silence followed. "Then what was?" she asked. I kept watching Margaret through the window.